Right, the last seconds are ticking. Oh, one more person joined. Well, I think it's time for us to start. First of all, I want to welcome everyone. And just, Abby, can you tell me, am I understandable? Is my audio working
Yeah.
well?
Yep. All good.
Well, welcome everyone. My name is Dede. I am the managing director of political party 020. We're a new political party at the UTA. And besides just being in the councils, helping to get real change done at the university, we are also planning to host a lot of social and political activities. Now, this guest lecture is a form of that, but besides that, we have, for example, teamed up with the Municipality of Amsterdam, with the GGD, in order to translate all kinds of Dutch materials on for example, on STDs, on tattoos and piercings into English. So while we are a political party, we really try to do more and get more change happen in Amsterdam. And now I would like to give the word to Abby, and Abby is the host of this talk. And from now on, I will keep my mouth closed. So thank you everyone for joining.
Yeah, thank you for the warm welcome, Dede, and thank you all for being here today. We're super excited to have you guys. My name is Abby, as Dede mentioned, and I'll be moderating the discussion for today, as well as giving just a brief introduction to our first ever guest lecturer, Professor Dr. Michael Meeuwis. Michael is a professor of Lingala and African linguistics at Ghent University in Belgium. A few of his main domains of research include Lingala, history of European production of knowledge in African colonial contexts, specifically the Belgian Congo, history of colonization and missionary in Africa, as well as post-colonialism and coloniality, which will be touched on within today's lecture. So before we move on to giving the floor to Michael, I wanted to briefly go over the plan for this lecture and just a few reminders as well. So first we'll start with Michael's presentation, which will last around 40 to 50 minutes. As you are watching the presentation, please feel free to privately message me any questions you may have. I'll also send a message in the chat so you can see which account to privately message, and you can select the O20 account to do so. And so you can do this by going to the chat function and doing that. Yeah, so I will keep track of the questions that you guys have and then pick a few to pose after the short break we're going to take once the presentation is finished. The short break will be around 5 minutes for a quick coffee or bathroom break, and then we'll come back and have the questions that you guys posed and begin a discussion based on those. So after that, we will allow people to individually ask their questions to Michael himself. And these questions may have come up during the discussion, or maybe we didn't mention it originally. So you can do this by using the hand raise function on Zoom. And so if you go to participants, it should be in the right-hand corner that you can do that, and we'll select you that way. So yeah, if you have any questions about this, please type them into the chat for me privately as well. You can see maybe that Dede had just raised his hand, so that works. Thank you, Dede. And yeah, I'll be happy to answer any questions that you guys have if you privately message me, or if you're having any technical issues or can't find certain buttons. So without further ado, I will let Professor Dr. Michael Meeuwis take the virtual stage.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Abby. And thank you, Marielle, Dede, and Anton too, for giving me the opportunity this evening to share my ideas on, well, intentionality, ideology, majority defensiveness, and meritocracy, as I put in the subtitle. The main title is Persisting Coloniality, so that's what I want to work towards. However, I would like to start with a story from history. In 1876, the journalist, actually a Welsh journalist, working for American newspapers, Henry Stanley, was asked by those newspapers to travel through Africa from east to west. You can see it on the map here. He started out in Zanzibar on the east coast, first went east into what is now Tanzania, went up to Lake Victoria, what would become Lake Victoria afterwards, met the Buganda Kingdom, traveled back south, then crossed Lake Tanganyika. And then what I'm more concerned with is this part here, where he traveled downstream along the Congo River. The first Westerner to do that. Of course, many Africans had done that before him, but okay, that's what Stanley did. He reached the West Coast here in 1877. Of course, as I already mentioned, Africans knew the Congo River very well. There was an intensive pre-colonial trade going along almost the entire stretch, which mostly worked in chains, meaning that one population would sell goods to another population living and working more downstream, who would then again travel a few kilometers or a few hundred kilometers downstream, sell it again to another population, and so on and so forth. So Stanley was simply the first Westerner to travel it and to put the river on European maps. Before him, it was just a blank spot on European maps. Now, after having reached the West Coast, he traveled back on a ship to Marseille, to Europe, to rest. And upon arrival, it's a pretty nice picture, actually. It's good material for a film. Upon arrival in the port of Marseille, emissaries of the Belgian King Leopold II were awaiting him. He didn't know what was happening. They stood there in the port, greeted him and said, "The Belgian King needs you, wants you to work for him." He was a journalist until then. He wants you to raise an army of European officers and African troops to found state posts for him, for the king, along the Congo River. And he wanted, King Leopold wanted Stanley to do that very fast because other European nations were already closing in, the French, the Portuguese, the English. So this starts in August 1879. Stanley hires a number of European, not all Belgian, a number of European army officers. And on the way south again, on the way from Europe to Africa by ship, of course, they also recruit African troops, but outside the Congo. So they recruit African troops on the West African coasts, as well as in Zanzibar, for instance, which they then bring by South Africa, by the Cape of Good Hope, to the mouth of the Congo River in West Africa. So this occupation and expropriation of land in what would become the Congo afterwards started in August 1879 and was done not by Stanley on his own, of course, but by this army of European officers with their African non-Congolese troops. So actually August 1879 is technically the beginning, the starting date of Belgian colonization. That's when, in the name of King Leopold II, land is occupied, land is expropriated, and the populations are subjugated, all to the sovereignty of King Leopold. Now, this territory was very soon recognized, for instance, by the US, but also by European nations. And that already happened before the famous or infamous Berlin Conference. So quite often it is believed that the start of the Belgian Congo, of Belgian colonization, is at the Berlin Conference. That's not completely true. It started before that. The Berlin Conference simply confirmed the territory as belonging to Leopold II, and set out some rules of presence of other European nations. By that I mean that when English traders or French missionaries or Portuguese missionaries wanted to work in that territory, well, there were certain rules that were designed at that Berlin Conference. And actually the Berlin Conference was much more important for that than for drawing any borders or so. It's not the case that European leaders stood around a table with a blank map of Africa and started drawing maps between lunch and tea time or so. That's not what really happened at the Berlin Conference. So one could say that from 1879 or 1885, if you want, to 1908, the Congo was a private possession of King Leopold, the Belgian King Leopold II. It was not a state colony in the strict sense. It was quite exceptional at world level. It was the possession of one person, of King Leopold II. And it was soon, again, after the Berlin Conference, that's also a misunderstanding that is often made. The term Congo Independent State or Congo Free State was not used at Berlin, it came after. Anyway, that's a detail. The important thing to know is that it was Leopold's private possession, and in 1908, the Belgian state took over the colony, and that's technically the beginning of the Belgian Congo. Now, the interesting part is, how come that Congo Independent State, Leopold's private possessions acquired for him by Stanley and his officers and their African troops, how come that was so early, so easily, and so swiftly recognized by international powers, including by the Vatican, for instance? And that happened before the Berlin Conference, after the Berlin Conference, some of it during the Berlin Conference, whatever. How come that went so swiftly? Because it was not a state, it was a private person. It was a king, all right, but he did it in his own name. He didn't do it in the name of Belgium. Well, one of the reasons for that is that the other powers, the other European colonizing nations, considered the Congo a handy buffer state in Central Africa, right? There were the Portuguese, the French, and the English, which were the most dominant colonizers. They had possessions around it, because the basin of the Congo River wasn't known yet to Europe. They had possessions around it, and of course they were vying for this newly discovered territory. So the Germans, the French, the English, the Portuguese says, well, if it's not going to belong to one of us, to one of the major powers in Europe, then maybe that's a good thing. Then we won't fight over it. Just give it to that crazy king in Belgium over there. He can have his garden, and that is a good buffer state between us. Other reasons why it was so swiftly recognized, exceptionally swiftly, was Leopold's rhetoric. He really sold his enterprise in terms of very high, very noble philanthropical objectives. And they bought that. It's difficult to believe, but most of them, all archives show that most of them, apart maybe from the Germans, there are some archive sources that show that the Germans knew that he had more plans than that. Well, he sold it, he wrapped it in gift paper, if you wish, that he was going to abolish the slave trade. Yes, there was slave trade at a minor scale, absolutely not comparable to the transatlantic slave trade from Africa to America. There was some slave trade that was run from the East African coast. He said he was going to abolish that. He said he was going to bring the Christian message to the Congolese, to improve the living conditions, etc. So he was able to wrap it, as I said, in terms of very high humanitarian objectives, if you want. In reality, of course, we know that from the start, he and his agents developed a system of most inhumane, brutal, murderous exploitation for pure economic enrichment. Which were the goods? Ivory and wood at first, which were shipped to Europe, but from the 1890s onwards, also rubber, there was a booming demand for rubber because the car industry was starting off. Yeah, so tires were needed, and that's why so much rubber from Central Africa was needed in European and American factories. Now, in its own time, so between 1879 and 1908, so during Leopold's reign in the Congo Independent State, there was already criticism and indignation for the cruelty, the cruel practices that were observable in the Congo. And that criticism and indignation came both from within Belgium and from other countries as well. One hears, for instance, there's many colonial debates going on in Belgium, not just right now, but they have been going on since the 1970s. And negationists, revisionists, or royalists would say, well, Leopold II was just a product of his own time, right? Others would say, well, he didn't really know what was happening in the Congo, all those cruelties and violations of human rights. He didn't know anything about it because he's never set foot there, which is true. He never set foot there, but he knew it very well. It's simply historically incorrect. We know from letters and from his own reactions to those letters that he knew very, very well what was going on and what his agents were doing there in the Congo. So that's simply historically incorrect, which we can also term nonsense, which it is. Now, those condemnations, one of the first people to launch those was the Polish, French, British, I should even say Ukrainian. He was born in the Ukraine, but in a Polish family, then went to France, then went to Britain, etc. Joseph Conrad was a sailor, traveled the world, was also a novelist. In 1890, in the year 1890, so that's really in the middle of King Leopold's reign, he spent half a year in the Congo independent state as a sailor. Lots of sailors were needed because everything was done by river. The entire occupation and expropriation of land, the penetration of colonial troops, all that was done, especially in the first year, by means of the rivers. And he observed, he wrote it down what he saw in terms of the cruel practices of the colonial agents, of the white colonial agents and their troops towards the local populations. And after his return, he spent 6 months there, I think from July to December 1890. And when he returns to Europe, he publicly accused the practices down in the Congo. And those experiences led to his novel. Actually, it's a long, short story. It's a short story, Heart of Darkness, but it's long, it's 100 pages, so it's pretty long for a short story. And then a real short story, An Outpost of Progress. Those are the two works he wrote that are set in the Congo. The rest of his oeuvre really is in Malaysia, the Indonesian archipelago. These are the only two, but the most known, especially Heart of Darkness, is well known, of course. As you can see in the title, An Outpost of Progress, well, progress, he means that very ironically. With these two books, stories, he wanted to, to show that what was happening in the Congo was just greed masquerading as philanthropy, as he put it down himself. Joseph Conrad also helped two famous names, Casement and Morel. These are the two historical figures who are most well known for having woken up the international community. 1904, correspondence and report by Casement, King Leopold's Rule in Africa by Morel, and Rudd Rubber in 1906. These are the three works that really made the ball rolling, but Conrad had a very important hand in that. Since his return in Europe, he had been providing these two men, Casement and Morel, with input, with his own experiences and observations he had made in the Congo. So one could say that Conrad is one of the earliest accusers and whistleblowers in Europe concerning the atrocities and human rights abuses under King Leopold. So it's not completely incorrect when Shihada writes, not that long ago, 2015, Conrad's work has been instrumental in underscoring the Congolese cause by depicting the atrocities committed and honestly depicting the murderous exploitation of the Congo by Belgium's King Leopold. Conrad's Heart of Darkness has proven to be ahead of its time and an exceptionally proleptic text, in rendering an extraordinary critique of colonialism, exposing its truly brutal nature and its lasting impact on the Congolese people who were left to suffer and still experience the effects of colonialism today. If one makes a textual analysis of Heart of Darkness, one indeed also in the text itself, in the novel, finds quite a number of anti-colonial condemnations, at least at the explicit level. I already quoted greed masquerading as philanthropy. That's actually a phrase not from Heart of Darkness, but from a preface that Conrad wrote to one of the editions of Heart of Darkness, where he contextualizes and explains his own novel. But quotes from the book: "To tear treasure out of the bowels of the land was the white's desire, with no more moral purpose at the back of it than there is in burglars breaking into a safe. The conquest of the earth, which mostly means taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much." Also, if you do a close reading of Heart of Darkness, the main character, Kurtz, well, the second main character, the main character is the narrator, Marlowe. Kurtz is a symbol of Leopoldian and by extension of European colonization. It's a symbol of this combination of rhetorical varnish of philanthropy, camouflaging, exploitation, murder, and greed. Conrad presents Kurtz as eloquent, but that is just a rhetorical layer, hiding a very materialist, selfish thief, tyrant, and murderer, right? That's the character of Kurtz in the book. And as you all know, I guess the book was made into a film by Coppola, Apocalypse Now, which is not set in the Congo, but in Vietnam. And Marlon Brando plays the role of Kurtz. And Marlon Brando too has eloquence. He's a very good speaker, writer, etc. But he's a tyrant and he's hollow and he's actually a psychopath, a smooth talker. All that is symbol of colonization. Okay, the movie also features Dennis Hopper, who plays the sycophant, right? And in the book Heart of Darkness, there is also a Russian man who absolutely defies Kurtz, right? Who believes every word he says. And that symbolizes the naive, well, those people who naively believe that colonization had humanitarian aims, humanitarian objectives. But of course, it's not as simple as that. It's not as simple as Shihada and others would like to depict. It's not as simple as simply saying Conrad was an accuser of colonization. And one of the most important people to have shown that, to have laid that bare, is Chinua Achebe, a Nigerian novelist and post-colonial thinker, who in 1975, in a lecture that he gave at Massachusetts University, leveled a very clear and cogent criticism of Conrad. The text can be found on the internet. It was published afterwards, but it is in full text available. It's not very long. It was a lecture, it was a talk. An image of Africa, racism in Conrad's Heart of Darkness. So what Achebe said, what Achebe made clear is that in spite of Conrad's good intentions to accuse, to criticize colonization and its hypocrisy, he said that at the same time, Heart of Darkness is permeated with racist representations. So some of the quotes from Achebe's lecture: Conrad is concerned with the deterioration of one European mind That was Marlowe's mind, right? The narrator's mind who travels through the Congo. Of one European mind caused by solitude and sickness. And Africa is the setting for this disintegration of the European mind. Africa is a metaphysical battlefield devoid of all recognizable humanity, into which the wandering European enters at his peril. Can nobody see the preposterous and perverse arrogance in thus reducing Africa to the role of props for the breakup of one petty European mind? Heart of Darkness is a book which parades in the most vulgar fashion prejudices and insults from which a section of mankind has suffered untold agonies and atrocities in the past and continues to do so in many ways and many places today. I am talking about a story in which the very humanity of Black people is called in question. Heart of Darkness represents Africa as trapped in primordial barbarity. Achebe's assessment is correct, it's fully correct. Other analysts, including myself and a colleague, have also come to the same inevitable conclusion when you reread Heart of Darkness, that it's full of racism, in spite of his good intentions to condemn early colonization. For instance, in the 1980s, there's two very important books, Conrad and Imperialism by Perry, Rule of Darkness by Brandlinger. Quite recently, Nijdesh Lawtoo of Leuven University in Belgium published Conrad's Shadow, a very good book. And then just earlier this year, just before the corona outbreak, my colleague Inge Brinkman and I gave a performance, if you wish, a dialogue performance on juxtaposing, if you want, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness and Achebe's own novel, Things Fall Apart. When you click on the link, on the YouTube link, you will just find a teaser, right? An announcement of the performance we did. It wasn't recorded, unfortunately. We did it only once because I think it was March 11th and then March 13th. There was the lockdown. We did it only once, and we wanted to do it again and then have a video crew, a camera crew, video it, but unfortunately that hasn't happened yet, but we count on doing that. Conrad's texts in plural, not just Heart of Darkness, but in fact also An Outpost of Progress and all his novels set in Indonesia, are replete with cultural evolutionist assumptions. So that is the idea that cultures, nations, civilizations across the world are all situated on one single ladder, in which the European civilization occupies the topmost step and the rest of the world is still stuck on steps below and before that, right? So there's also a time element in it. They are not yet where Europe is, but they represent a stage where Europe used to be. So it's interesting to study them, because by studying them, we can learn something about ourselves in Europe. We can know where we came from, where we once were, right? That's actually the basis and the starting point of historical linguistics as it arose, for instance, in Germany. We're going to study the others, because they represent a stage where we once used to be, right? That's the logic in that cultural evolutionist scheme. So some examples of that from Heart of Darkness. Going up that river, so that's the Congo River, going up that river was like traveling back to the earliest beginnings of the world, when vegetation rioted on the earth and the big trees were kings. An empty stream, a great silence, an impenetrable forest. We were traveling in the night of first ages. You see the time element of first ages, of those ages that are gone, leaving hardly a sign, no memories. Prehistoric earth, prehistoric man, those are phrases that recur amply in the text. I don't think a single one of them had any clear idea of time as we at the end of countless ages have. They still belong to the beginnings of time, had no inherited experience to teach them, as it were. Africans in Heart of Darkness are represented as still belonging to their natural environment. Vague forms of men, running, bent, double, leaping, gliding, distinct, incomplete, evanescent. They faced the river, stamped their feet, nodded their horned heads, swayed their scarlet bodies. They shook towards the fierce river demon a bunch of black feathers. A whirl of black limbs, a mess of hands clapping, of feet stamping, of bodies swaying, of eyes rolling, under the droop of heavy and motionless foliage. To look at him, he was an African man, to look at him was as edifying as seeing a dog in a parody of breeches and a feather hat walking on his hind legs. About language too, Africans, Congolese, for Conrad, don't have language yet, right? They are not there yet. They are not sufficiently evolved on that one single letter of mankind. A complaining clamor modulated in savage discourse filled our ears. They shouted periodically together strings of amazing words that resembled no sounds of human language. And the deep murmurs of the crowd, interrupted suddenly, were like the response of some satanic litany. So, to summarize, what we see in Conrad is a cohabitation, a conflicting cohabitation of, on the one hand, explicit intentions that are anti-colonial, and then an underlying ideology that is very, very different from those intentions. And by ideology, I do not mean, I do not use ideology in the political science sense, in the sense of great political schools of thought like liberalism, Marxism, nationalism, socialism, etc. I rather use it in the way it is used in sociology and anthropology. Namely, it refers to underlying patterns of meaning, frames of interpretation, most often unconsciously and implicitly shared, unquestioned systems of thought that are felt to be commonsensical and natural. So systems of thought that are unreflectively believed to be normal because they are acquired and internalized through socialization. So intentions and ideology can be conflicting, right? Can be out of harmony if you want. And one does not cancel the other. It happens all the time in all types of ideology that at the explicit, more conscious layer, you have this denial of the underlying ideology. So it's not that Conrad had certain intentions, but a different ideology, or that he had a certain ideology, but different intentions. It's more and. Those things exist side by side. It's actually an essential and omnipresent ingredient of ideology that at the surface there will always be an explicit intention that negates it, right? That denies it rather, not so much negate, but denies it. Now his ideology, his underlying ideology of unilateral cultural evolutionism was not just his own, of course, that's the definition of ideology, it's shared, was widely criticized by African scholars studying how Europeans imagined and actually imagined in colonial times, but in post-colonial times also continued and have continued to imagine Africa, including in the human and social sciences. Those are sciences, of course, human and social sciences are not free of this underlying ideology. In the 1970s, for instance, I already mentioned Achebe. There was also Archie Mafeje, very important thinker, a thinker about thought, right? A thinker about European thought. How did Europe think about Africa? How did it imagine Africa? Mudimbe has written very important books whose titles are pretty telling. The Idea of Africa, how Europe made an idea of Africa. The Invention of Africa. And then there's also the non-African scholar, but we used to work at the University of Amsterdam. So I wanted to mention him too, who coined the term the denial of coevalness in a very important book, Time and the Other. The denial of coevalness refers to the fact that European thinking denies the other, the non-European, the fact of living in the same time as Europe, right? This tendency to always put Africa or other parts of the non-West at another time than where Europe is situated. This ideology, this underlying frame of interpretation has persisted after formal decolonization. We could say that in Africa, at least, I'm not talking about Israel and Palestine, there still is formal colonization going on there. In Africa, colonization, some countries gained their independence in the 1950s, others late in the 60s, others in the 70s, but more or less as an average date, one can say that in 1960, formal decolonization ended as a historical era, but this has not entailed an ending of colonialism as an ideology, as a representation and imagination of Africa, and in fact, the global South in general. So I like to make a distinction between colonization and colonialism. Colonization being a historical era that one can identify, that began and that stopped at certain dates, and colonialism, which is the ideology, the representation, the imagination, among others, along cultural evolutionist lines. And a third term that I like to use, that I like to distinguish, is coloniality. Coloniality being a property of a certain way of thinking. So for instance, where do we see, these are just two examples, there's many more to find, where do we see colonialism as an ideology that has persisted? For instance, in the still widely used terms and distinction between traditional and modern, right? My students are not allowed to use that any longer, but you can see it everywhere, right? Whenever social phenomena in Africa are described, are interpreted, 9 times out of 10, you will see traditional and modern, these concepts used as an interpretive tool, which is highly problematic, I think, because traditional and modern always means westernized, right? As if there was no change in Africa before colonization, right? There was a whole history of Africa before colonization. There were many changes that happened there. Why were those changes that happened called modern versus traditional, right? So implicitly, modern always means westernized. Traditional always means always has this connotation of backward on the ladder, on the evolutionist ladder. Development aid, for instance, or development cooperation, name it as you wish, but it is also replete with a very problematic frame of interpretation. There's this discourse that the global north is developed. I wonder along which criteria, along certain criteria maybe yes, among others certainly not, versus an Africa that is either underdeveloped or undeveloped or still developing, right? The processual term developing nations, which I find very problematic because who is going to decide on a degree of development? Who is going to decide when this developing stops, ends? When has, for instance, an African country reached the point of development? Who is going to decide on that? Well, the West, of course, because the global North, of course, because they are the standard towards which those African countries should evolve, right? So there are these two interesting scholars who have written quite something about the problematic assumptions of development aid, of development discourse, saying the development paradigm rooted in colonial heritages, based on modernist notions of progress and premised on unsustainable economic growth. I'm still in the realm of the ideology, the ideology of cultural evolutionism, of Euro superiority. It's not just Eurocentrism, it's Euro superiority, because the frame of interpretation still assumes that Europe, or the global north in general, is situated at the top of the evolution. Well, this ideology persists not only in Europe's intercontinental perceptions and relations with the global south, but it also permeates perceptions of minorities of African and other descent living in Africa. So it also permeates intracontinentally, not just intercontinentally, patterns of representations, of relationships, of inequality, of socio-economic exclusions of opportunities, which white majorities in Europe continue to construct around and against those who they other as allochtones. Other is a verb. These people are othered, right? They are not the same types of citizens in the discourse and in the representations. This is an ideological layer that is, again, very often hidden under an explicit layer of the best of intentions. Again, in these intercultural dealings, there is also this conflictual cohabitation of intentions and ideology, of a well-meant rhetoric and structural racism underneath that rhetoric. It's not very different from Leopoldian times, right? One of the first actually to have pointed out this persisting coloniality, that's the term I use, right? It's a property of a way of thinking, coloniality, of persisting coloniality in intracontinental majority-minority patterns was, I think, in the Dutch-speaking zone at least, Raymond Corbin, who worked at different universities, Radboud, Tilburg, Leiden. A very important book, unfortunately, it first appeared only in Dutch, Wildheid en Beschaving. If you can read Dutch, read the introduction. It's an absolute must read. This is the 1980s, and he makes it clear how colonialism as an ideology, so the way Africans or other colonized populations in the world were treated and looked at how that is continued in intracontinental dealings between majority and minority. 2 years later, wrote another book, Alterity, Identity and Image, which is also very good. And then in Flanders, a book that also showed this is Het Belgische Migrantendebat by Jan Blommaert and Jeff Verschuren, which got an English translation, Debating Diversity. They also show how majority-minority relationships in Belgium are actually a continuation of colonialist representations, imaginations, and perceptions. This kind of cohabitation of good intentions with an underlying unself-reflecting ideology of superiority is omnipresent. It's not just in race relationships, in inter-ethnic relationships, it's about every majority-minority interaction. It is present in all those interactions. Whether it is heteronormativity, sexism, ageism, ableism, or other patterns of degradation and exclusion, it is omnipresent in that. This cohabitation of I'm not a racist, I'm not homophobic, I'm not a sexist, etc. with I respect elderly people and so on. The cohabitation of those good intentions with an underlying, very often unconscious, unself-reflecting ideology of superiority. Now, again, when I talk about majority-minority, I don't simply mean that in quantitative senses, right? In the quantitative sense of statistics, I also mean it in terms, I especially mean it in terms of privileged versus underprivileged. What is equally omnipresent, so not only that cohabitation of good intentions and an underlying conflicting ideology is omnipresent, but also the defensiveness of the majority. The strange recurring patterns of defensiveness. For instance, in defensiveness, for instance, against racism, accusations of racism, the defensiveness, defenses against that, accusations of sexism, etc. The way the majority reacts to that defensively. This has really very clearly come to the surface in the debate around Zwarte Piet, or Black Pete if you want. So many people would react so violently. What are you calling me a racist? Because I want to retain this folkloric tradition of Zwarte Piet. How can you call me a racist for wanting that I have black friends, right? Same thing with sexism, same thing with heteronormativity, and so on. Very violent reactions, very violent defensiveness, which is almost the most painful aspect of the whole debate. How come? Where does this defensiveness come from? Well, there's a reduction of racism or sexism or homophobia to exceptional cases of individually admitted, consciously chosen, expressed, proudly delinquent racism, right? When you reduce racism to that one individual racist who says, yes, I am a racist and I am proud of it. I have consciously chosen not to like people with a different skin color. If you reduce racism to that, you're not going to get very far, right? It simply reduces these structural systems of thought to individual hooliganism, right? It's not going to help you very much. But the reduction of racism and other exclusionary ideologies to that individual level is actually what leads to the violent defensiveness. I certainly haven't invented that myself. Robin DiAngelo has written about that in a very important book, White Fragility, why it's so hard for white people to talk about racism. She has many bits on YouTube. There's one I'm referring to here, where she says the quote or the defense, "I'm not a racist," is only half the story. I think the most effective adaptation of the system of racism to the challenges of the civil rights movement was to reduce a racist to a very simple formula. A racist is an individual, always an individual, not a system, who consciously does not like people based on race and who intentionally seeks to be mean to them. Individual conscious intent. When you reduce ideologies and systems of thought and systems of exclusion to that, then you're gonna get white fragility. Then you're gonna find it very hard for white people to talk about racism, right? Reni Edolodge, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, very recent book. Now, you may not agree with the advice the title appears to be giving. It's not really that what she wants to do. But the reason why is very important, because it simply appeared to her so often impossible because of that defensiveness. And the defensiveness is there because of the reduction to individual intent. A very aggressive case of white defensiveness, you might have come across him on the internet, on the social media, is Jordan Peterson of the University of Toronto, who reacts very, very fiercely when systems of thought, systems of exclusion, such as racism, such as sexism, are laid bare. White privilege isn't real. The idea of white privilege is absolutely reprehensible. Some of his quotes. Now, he also has very strange ideas about IQ and IQ tests. He finds them more liable, more valid than anything else in the social and human sciences. And worse, he correlates it with ethnicity. He believes in a correlation of IQ with ethnicity. The average Jew IQ is between 110 and 150. And IQs are absolute, not ethnically or culturally biased. He's saying that they're not ethnically and culturally biased, but he's saying that they correlate with ethnicity, that certain ethnicities have lower IQs than others. I've just given two YouTube links there. There's plenty to find, but I just wanted to name him because he's a very clear case of this and this, right? Of very aggressive defensiveness. Actually, this last point, his belief, Peterson's belief in a correlation between IQ and ethnicity, is a beautiful case of what, in a very recent book, very nice book, Angela Saini has analyzed. Her book is about how conservative and neo-white supremacist movements are reviving the idea of genetically distinct racial groupings and of IQ correlations, of correlations between IQ, race, IQ, ethnicity, and so on. One of the quotes from an interview with her in The New Scientist: power differences have reshaped the idea of race as well as pseudoscience throughout history, and they continue to do so. So it's very scaring what she is observing and analyzing, is that the biological idea of race actually never really disappeared and is going through even a revival now. Now, when we say that ideology, so systems underlying systems of thought, are unconscious, they pass as normal, they are unmindful, they're commonsensical, they are acquired through socialization, they are internalized through socialization, excuse me. Well, all that is not an excuse, right? One could say, well, I have the best of intentions and maybe I partake of an ideology, but I'm a child of my time. So I'm not to blame. Well, I think you are to blame, right? That is not an excuse. One cannot leave it at that. One has the responsibility, the constant responsibility, as the member of any privileged minority, and I am one, to constantly self-reflect, to constantly question the systems of thought one has been socialized in. In other words, one has to question one's own complicity, right? One's own complicity in reproducing and in continuing those systems of thought, in not fighting them, in not self-reflecting them. That's the only progress one can really make. And one is never there. One is never really there. So I consider myself highly privileged. I come from a privileged family socioeconomically. I'm heterosexual, I'm white, I'm a boomer or an almost boomer of 52 years old. I belong to every criterion of majority, right? Of privilege. And I have to self-reflect constantly. I want to, rather, right? Everything I think, everything I've been socialized in, is this what I want to think, right? And is this okay to think there? And I will never assume, I will never say to anyone that I am there yet. I cannot understand how certain people can say, I am decolonized. I cannot know that. I'm trying constantly. I do it and I want to decolonize, but it's a process rather. And I am not the one who can say that I have reached that stage at any one point. If anyone wants to tell me that, look, what you just said, what you just thought contains some racist assumptions, then I'm going to listen to that. And I'm not going to be aggressively defensive, right? I have to listen to that and self-reflect. So one can certainly not assume that one is there. One is never decolonized. And one can certainly not say about oneself that one is decolonized. So one has to shut up. One has to shut up for a while. As a member of a majority, of a white majority, heterosexual majority, whatever you have, one has to shut up and listen. Listen, listen, and listen. Power is invisible to those who have it. I find that a very important quote. It is between parentheses, but it's actually too important to be between parentheses. Power and privilege too is invisible to those who have it. You have to be shown it that you have a certain privilege, that you have a privileged background, etc. Right? Someone has to wake you up. You know? Pain is invisible to those who don't have it. I so often wonder how white people can say, well, they're saying that that or that was racist, but I don't really think it's racist. Or you shouldn't exaggerate, right? When colored people, black people complain about racism, well, you shouldn't exaggerate. It's not really racist. How can they know? How can they know on earth? It would be the same thing. It's comparable to men saying, well, you know, women complaining about labor pains, they're exaggerating. It can be that hard. It can be that painful. How on earth can they know, right? Well, the same applies to racism. How on earth can you know if you're not a victim of racism? How on earth can you know what is sexist if you're not a victim of sexism, or at least if you're on the side that produces sexism? Same for heteronormativity and so on and so forth, right? And it has nothing to do with white shame. That's also very often part of the rhetoric on behalf of the white defensiveness. Well, whites shouldn't be ashamed of being white. No, of course not, but it has nothing to do with that. The desire to constantly self-reflect about your privileges, about your stance, have nothing to do with shame, with white shame. They have to do with responsibility and the duty to question your possible complicity. And certainly with an awareness that silence is violence. You know, that when you don't do anything, when you don't say anything as a member of a majority, you are complicit, right? So I believe that the steps that are minimally necessary in order to move away from that white defensiveness is, yes, what I already mentioned. We cannot reduce racism, sexism, homophobia to the level of individual conscious intent. That's one. Secondly, we have to move away from naive multiculturalism to politicized multiculturalism. And that's, of course, in the realm of race and ethnicity relationships. What do I mean by naive multiculturalism? Is the multiculturalism that simply adores food from other cultures, clothing, music, things like that, right? That's naive multiculturalism. Politicized multiculturalism is a multiculturalism that recognizes that people from other cultures, from other ethnic backgrounds in Europe are not only from a different culture with different food and different clothes and different music preferences and so on. They are also socially, politically marginalized, right? So multiculturalism always needs a political ingredient of analysis. Right? It has to be politicized. It cannot simply be a naive multiculturalism that talks about harmony between people of different backgrounds and learning their culture and their language and their food and so on. That will never be sufficient because it depoliticizes reality. It depoliticizes the reality of disenfranchisement. And that implies also an awareness of the fact that the world is not a level playing field. For instance, in scholarly research at universities, what is still the case until today is to put it bluntly, that the global north does research on the global south. It is as simple as that. That is reality. You may find a few exceptions where someone from the global south comes to the global north and does research on the global north there, but you will be hard pressed to find those exceptions, right? It is still the global north doing research on the global south. And I know what I'm talking about because I work in a Department of African Studies, right? So the epistemologies still go one way, right? And in principle, they should go both ways, but they cannot go both ways because the world is not a level playing field. People from the global south simply don't have the means, the economic means, that we have to do research there, right? They cannot, they simply cannot come here, not the economic means, and they're simply not as easily allowed in as I am allowed in Congo or Tanzania. When I travel there, it's a piece of cake. Try being a Tanzanian and travel to Europe. It will be very much harder, right? So it is asymmetrical, right? And we have to be aware of that. We cannot simply say, well, everyone can go everywhere and do research, etc. No, it's impossible. Infrastructurally, it is impossible because the world is not equal. I was talking about, I already alluded to the Department of African Studies that I work in. To my big shame, it's an all-white staff. We are 5 professors there. It's all white. So how much Africa is there in African studies is a question I often ask my colleagues. And then they say, well, some of them would say, well, Africans can come here and do research on us too. Can? In which sense? In the sense of be allowed by you? Yeah, maybe you allow them, but can in the sense of, is it possible? Is it infrastructurally possible? Do they have the same funds that you have to go and do research in Africa? Of course not. Previously, the staff at our department was even all male, not just all white, but all male. In 2014, we hired a woman. So we are now 4 white male professors, 1 white male professor, and then assistants and junior researchers and so on. Well, in 2014, it was very, very hard to hire that woman. So I was in the committee and I made the point that, look, this is an all male staff. We need to hire a woman here. And there was a woman among the candidates who made it. And as reactions, the reactions I got was that, no, you should not look at gender. You should purely look at quality, at quantity. Quality is measured by means of quantity in the university world. That should not be gender should not be a criterion. Well, those are the reactions that I got. It worked. Well, not those reactions, but the fact that I insisted and that some other people too continue to insist. It's all white. Yes, it is all white. How much Africa is there in African studies? Not a lot. Not a lot. And what I try to do is to step away personally, right? Individually, personally, I try to consciously step away from what I call coltan humanities or coltan human sciences. So coltan is this mineral, as you know, that is mined in Africa, and it is in each of our cell phones. So it's mined in Africa, brought to Europe, processed in factories, and then used for cell phones. And there's a lot of there's a lot of human rights abuses in those mines where the coltan from your iPhone or other smartphone comes from. Well, humanities and social sciences in and about Africa are not very different from that. What they do is they go to Africa as researchers, go and grab data, information there from Africans, come back home with it, process it in a scholarly article, in a PhD dissertation or what have you, and it remains there. It remains in Europe, in the West. I consciously try to stop doing that. I don't want to so much write, I don't like the aboutness anymore. The global north doing research about the global south. I prefer partnerships, and I prefer the data to be collected there. I'm not going to Africa all that often anymore, you know. I work at the Department of African Studies, but I feel very uncomfortable to again, on some kind of a grant or scholarship that I got, go to Africa and go and collect data there just the same way as coltan is collected in mines. Right, I prefer to do historical research that I can do in archives, etc. But I feel quite uncomfortable with doing field work in Africa precisely for these reasons. I was talking about this reaction that I got in 2014. We should not look at gender, we should simply look at quantity and the merits of the candidates when we're going to hire someone. That brings me to the issue of meritocracy at universities. So meritocracy at the surface seems very self-evident. It simply says the person with the most merits deserves the job, right? Looks very self-evident. But it is very questionable when you look at it a bit closer. First of all, what kind of merits are we talking about, right? Is it just merits of having published all the time? What about human and social merits? What about social skills? What about social relevance of the research that you have produced? What about teaching quality, teaching devotion? That is in reality never really measured, at least not at my university, but I don't think it's an exception. When you want to get hired at a university, just make sure you got a lot of publications. It's pretty simple as that. And that you can bring in a lot of money for the university. You will have to do a test class. Yeah, you will have to do some teaching in front of the committee with students, but that is not really taken into account, right? Even if one accepts those criteria, those parameters, which I don't think one should, but even if one accepts those, namely the criteria of numbers of publications, pure quantification, numbers of publication, amount of money you can bring in, you have brought in for your previous university, your previous job, and the amount of money that you will be able to earn for the university that wants to hire you. Even if one accepts those criteria, even then, who has had the privilege to attain those standards, right? Again, people with privileged backgrounds. So if you're simply going to compare candidates and pick the one with the most merits, meritocracy, you presuppose that all of those candidates had the same possibilities, had the same opportunities, right? Men, women alike, which is not the case. Women don't have the same opportunities in a young academic career. People from other parts of the world didn't have the same opportunities as that other candidate, right? So meritocracy presupposes, again, the world to be a level playing field, which it isn't. Society to be a level playing field, which it isn't. It isn't, right? What meritocracy does is perpetuate inequalities. First of all, it presupposes that there are no inequalities, that there is no such thing as more privileged candidates and less privileged candidates, but it perpetuates them because the person with the best, who had the most opportunities to reach certain standards, will get the job. And if you do that over and over again, you simply perpetuate those inequalities and you never attain at least the presence of role models, right? people who can be an example for other people that, hey, I can do this too. So what I think should be done is at least the system of competitive comparison should be replaced by an active search committee. If, as is the case in Ghent, it's all white, you want to diversify, you have a vacancy, go and look for someone who answers, who can diversify your staff, right? And don't start comparing in terms of merits, right? If you have a job description, the person to be hired needs to be able to teach this, that, and that, needs to be able to publish on this, that, and that, do research on this and that and that. You have an absolute standard. You don't have a relative standard. You don't have a comparative standard that you need to compare, right? You have this absolute standard, and then start searching. Start searching for a woman if your staff is too male, a non-white person if your staff is all white, etc. Start searching for them, and stop when you have found someone. Don't start comparing the merits, etc. on a CV. When you have found someone who qualifies for the job and who can diversify your staff, take that person. If the person can do it, she can do it. That's enough. You don't have to take the best all the time, because the best, again, does not take into account previous opportunities or absence of opportunities. Okay, I think this is where I want to stop. I had some other notes that I can maybe use, some other thoughts that maybe can come up when the questions arise. But for now, I would like to thank you very much for your attention and for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. Now, Abby, you want to take it over?
Yeah, great. Yes, thank you so much for that. I think now we will do a super quick break, and then we already have some questions posed by you guys that we will start with, and then we'll open up the floor. I think we've got about 3 questions already posed, and then we'll open up the floor to you guys to ask your questions as well. So let's see.
Let's just take 3 minutes, just very quick, and then we can, just take 10-15 minutes for the questions, because we told everyone we'd be done by 8:30, so we'll be able to reach that deadline in a sense.
Did I talk too long? How long did I talk?
You talked a little bit too long, but that's totally fine. You had a lot.
Okay.
Yeah. Got a lot to learn.
Okay.
All right, everyone. See you in.
Guys. Yep.
Maybe it's also nice to tell everyone that people who are still here, right? It's fine if you're gone, of course, because it's a break. That we will organize more guest lectures. We're always looking for other guest lecturers. They don't always have to be professors, right? Whether they're people that have written a book, are part of an organization, or just students with a lot of knowledge on a certain topic. We're always open for this kind of input. And of course, it's Corona, so it's a bit harder for us to organize these kinds of events. But Zoom is a way for us to at least get people to attend, and hopefully in the future we can do them in real life. And besides that, if you are a student at the UVA and you are interested in trying to get change at the university itself, you're always also welcome to reach out to us if you want to join and become a candidate, for example. At the moment, we are working closely together with organizations such as OBOF, Our Bodies, Our Voice, to get actual policy change done at the UVA concerning sexual harassment of women. Besides that, we're working closely together with the Green Office of the UVA to get more sustainable changes done. Besides that, we're working closely together now with even some real estate agencies to work on the question of housing and to see whether we can be of importance and we can get some change done there. So if any of you is socially active or politically active, you can always reach out to us. Or if you want to start your own party, right, you can always ask us for information. We're only 4 months in here. And if any of you are interested in your own ideas, etc., you can always reach out. Let's take one more minute. I think everyone will almost be back. Some people left, but that's fine. Just wait for Abby to return back in our beautiful screen.
Sure. Is it 8:20? Did I talk for an hour?
You talked for 70 minutes.
My God, I apologize. I apologize. I thought it was much shorter. Sorry about that.
All right, Abby, I think it's time. You can take over again.
Yeah, of course. So I think probably for time's sake, I'm just going to go through, and there were a few people who wanted to ask their questions directly. So I was going to give them that opportunity. So I think firstly, if Richard would like to pose his question. If he's back.
Yes, there's Richard.
Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very informative. I very much enjoyed it. My question is this. In Chinua Achebe's seminal novel, Things Fall Apart, there is a dramatization of an Igbo village's culture adapting towards the initial stages of British colonialization in the Nigerian Valley. Specifically, is this conflict that is presented in the novel, that being one of intra-tribal reprisal, an accurate reflection of the cultural changes apparent within these societies at the time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's echo. Maybe everyone. Okay, thank you for switching off. The interesting thing is that Things Fall Apart was written in the 1950s, right? It was published in 1958. And in the 1970s, when Achebe leveled these criticisms in 1970s, he actually admitted, indirectly, but he admitted that in the 1950s, he himself was still pretty much thinking along colonialist epistemologies, right? You just mentioned yourself intertribal rivalries, etc. Well, he himself would say afterwards, well, I hate the word tribe. As you can see here, tribes were not all that important in the past. So his criticism of Conrad in the 1970s is actually indirectly, and I think Naidesh Lawtu shows that very nicely in his recent articles on Conrad and Achebe. His stance of the 1970s is really a different Achebe. Right? There are two different Achebes. His criticism of Conrad, and through Conrad, of a European imagination of Africa along lines of tribe, intertribal rivalries, etc. Well, he retracted that himself. Yeah, his criticism of Conrad was actually a criticism, if you read it carefully, of his own Things Fall Apart. He would never, in the 1970s, he would never have written the same books. So there are actually two Achebes, and if you read his interviews of the 1970s, it is, again, indirectly, but it is kind of a retraction of the colonialist epistemology that he himself was a victim of in Things Fall Apart. So Things Fall Apart, you should certainly not read Things Fall Apart as representing Achebe's most recent, okay, died in 2013, as the more mature Achebe, as Achebe, as the post-colonial Achebe. right? Those are two very different persons with two very different systems of thoughts. And I like that. I like that because, again, it is an example of self-reflection. It is an example of criticizing oneself, analyzing oneself, and the ideologies that one has been socialized in, and that one at an earlier point of life was maybe a victim of herself. You see, so it's very important to keep that in mind.
Perfect. So I just want to keep it moving along, but I think next we have Naomi wanted to ask her question directly.
Yeah, 1 second. Okay. I wanted to ask in regards of the university as an educational institution, how like they can make the environment within the university a little bit more, sorry, comfortable for like Black students and students of color, especially with what has been going on lately around the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah.
I feel like the uni really didn't do much besides posting the black box on Instagram, which I found totally unuseful because it's not a brand, it's like an university, and there are so many readings and documentaries or other sort of resources that they could have provided for Black students, but not only, also for other students to get to know better like the circumstances. Also because a lot of Black students, me as well, I totally feel out of place and unrepresented 9 times out of 10, unless when I'm with my Black friends or something. So as an educational institution which should help dismantle this type of biases and discrimination, what do you think could be a possible way to help?
Yeah,
this was my question.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so first of all, certainly agree on the black box thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was quite an issue at our department too. Not everyone agreed. Secondly, the representation of Black people in the student population is absolutely insufficient, and it certainly is more so in staff, right? The higher up you go, as I already mentioned, we are a Department of African Studies, there's no Africa in it, right? Nothing, which is shameful. So first of all, staff should be seriously diversified, and not only in a Department of African Studies, because then it simply becomes an excuse, right? Oh yeah, in African Studies, we should have some people of African origin. In the Asian languages, we should have some people of Asian origins, and so on. That's not sufficient. It should be in all departments, even in the Department of Engineering Sciences, and so on. So there is certainly pressing need for diversification in staff, and in staff up to the highest jobs, because what you see is a pyramid. There is some diversity in the lowest ranks, if you want. The higher up you go to professorship, full professorship, etc., it becomes more and more male, more and more white. So there is an absolute problem there, which I think, as I mentioned, should be tackled by active search committees that are actively going to look for diversification. So I think that's one, diversification in staff, but then also in the student population. Yeah, it's a vicious circle. Of course, you don't feel comfortable. I absolutely understand that if staff is all white, and if the epistemology is going to be completely European, how can people of African descent feel comfortable? No, I absolutely agree with that. So there's a vicious circle there. You should at least start with staff, and then student population should also be more diverse, right? How are you going to do that? How are you going to diversify your student population? If you see the ratio, okay, in Belgium, for instance, 1 out of 5 inhabitants of Belgium is has some migration background. right? 1 out of 5 in the total population of 11 million. Do you think 1/5 of the student population or staff population of a university has a migration background? No, not at all. Yeah? So something should be done about that in order to reflect diversity in society. The university at this moment, both at the level of student population and at the level of staff, does not reflect the diversity that we have in society, right? And something should absolutely be done about that. So in terms of staff, I already mentioned it, in terms of students too, yeah? Do something about it and start at the lower levels of education. What we see in Belgium is that, okay, in order to enter university, you have to have had a proper secondary education, which not everyone has. And again, there are privileges there. There are opportunities and there are people with much less opportunities. So start already there. I know from experience that people with a different skin color in Belgium are advised when they're 12 years old, are advised when they enter secondary education, oh no, you should not do ASO. ASO being the most classical, the highest form of secondary education. Go and do technical education. Go and do, go and study some manual profession, some manual job, right? So it already starts there. So it has to be tackled in society outside universities too, in primary, in secondary education, so as to obtain a better reflection of society at universities. And
sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I just had, I think, 1 to 2 more questions.
Oh.
We are running a bit over time. Oh no, you're fine. I just wanted to see if the last 2 could maybe go ahead with their question. I think I had Gabriella and Chimera. Maybe if you can ask it shortly and then we can wrap up after those 2.
Yeah, I'll ask mine. First of all, thanks for this presentation. It was really, really interesting. You mentioned about defensiveness, and my experience whenever I hear someone say like, I'm not racist, but blah, 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 blah. I feel like there's an attempt from the speaker side to portray themselves as like to be able to be objective. Like, I'm not racist, but I can objectively say blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
So, I want to ask is this defensiveness just a part of a bigger problem, which is like this idea of objectiveness and like our privileging of science, for example, over other ways of knowledge, other ways of learning that is ingrained not only in academia, but also in every aspect of our lives.
Yeah. It has to do, yeah, I think so. Objectification of racism, as if one can measure racism objectively. I completely agree with that, and it has to do. It links up. I can link it up with what I said. The comparison I made with birth pains, right? How can anyone who has not given birth say, "Well, it can't be that bad. You're exaggerating," right? That is the same. That is the same thing as objectifying it. The pain must be objectively measurable for everyone. That's the same thing that happens when white people say, well, you're complaining about racism, but it can't be all that bad. Yeah, you're exaggerating. And that, I agree with you, that assumes some kind of an objective, universal, kind of measurable experience there, which is simply not the case. Yeah? You cannot objectively, universally measure that pain. You cannot. You simply cannot feel what it is. You can try, and you have to try, but you simply cannot. Wait, where was it that I mentioned that one has to listen? Listen, right? When I say that to fellow white people, they say, what? can I not give my opinion on what is racism and what is not racist? And I answer, no, you cannot. You cannot have an opinion on what is racist, just the same way as a man cannot have an opinion whether birth pains are painful or not. It is simply impossible. So shut up and listen. Listen for once, right? Listen and try to reflect, try to at least reach a level of empathy, right? And that has exactly to do, that defensiveness has to do, well, no, it must be possible for me as a white person to also measure degrees of racism. This is racism to a degree of 6 on a scale of 10. This is racism to a degree of 9 out of 10, as if those things are measurable from the outside of being a racist, a victim of racism. Mm-hmm. So I agree with you, yeah. The idea of some kind of universally measurable degree of racism.
Okay, so I think very, very quickly, if we can just move to the last question, and then we will wrap it up for you guys. Kimira?
Before I ask my question, I have some comments to make. I'm sorry, I can't really rush this because I feel like this is such an important conversation already. But to go back to your previous comments on Naomi had asked about the representation at the uni, I feel like, yeah, it's very important to say how the university is very terribly underrepresented in both staff and students, especially in an officially majority minority city. And I know that in this university, diversity means more women or internationalization. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of a guise of like attempting to diversify the university. And yeah, your comments were very valid in the sense that like someone like Gloria Wecker has suggested almost everything you have said in order to solve the problem of underrepresentation and decolonization at the university. But the university ends up responding by doing something like hiring a white chief diversity officer. Mm-hmm. Going on to just do things along those lines. And it's so evident in the fact that like professors of color tend to leave the university in less than 1 year of working here. And typically students of color, especially within my course, tend to always drop out. So yeah, like I think it's such a crazy problem, especially when the university even actively recruits students from from high schools here in Amsterdam, but avoids areas like the Belmer. It's such things like that that is very blatantly racist and it's just frustrating. But yeah, my question was, you were speaking about no longer blaming the individual in the sense that like we can't say, oh, it is this one person that is racist. But what I wanted to ask is, if we don't blame the individual, how do we then find accountability? I know it's more than the individual, but like the systematic racism in general.
Absolutely.
How do we find accountability if we're not just focusing on the individual?
Yeah, we have. When I said that we don't have to focus on the individual, I meant we don't have to. We have to go beyond focusing on the self-declared racist, right? That individual hooliganism that is proud to say, I'm a racist. I don't like people with a different skin color. That's what I meant when we have to go beyond targeting the individual. We have to target the individual for what I explained on this slide, right? Every individual any individual member of a majority, of any kind of privileged majority, has to be targeted for not self-reflecting. It is not an excuse. It is not an excuse that ideology is something that you're born in and that you're socialized in and that you have internalized, etc. No, you have to constantly self-reflect as a member of a majority. And if an individual member of a majority doesn't do that, then yes, that person is to blame. That person is to blame for not self-reflecting and for not being prepared to change her or his beliefs that she or he was socialized in, right? Because then that's complicity. So there, yes. if that responsibility is not taken to constantly self-reflect and to criticize yourself and to realize that you're never there, then you are to blame as an individual member of majority. So those are two different levels. Would you agree?
Yeah, I agree.
And if I actually can add one thing to you mentioned the diversity officer, for example, at UVA, and that is something that we as well are, actually, I might even make you even more angry, but the position is an unpaid position. The lady who is running it is at the same time a tutor for first years and has only a couple of hours per week allocated to solve diversity within the university. So yes, we see a lot of symbolism happening, but not a lot of action. So I really want to say that we fully, the problem is being noted now. We hope we can change it, but yeah, it's something that is hard to do within UVA at the moment.
Yeah, and she just got self-appointed again for another 3 years without any student consultation at all. So that's just ridiculous. But yeah, I'm a member of the Central Student Council. So that's something I am actively trying to work against currently.
Good.
Fortune.
All right, well, thank you guys so much for all your questions and for this really great discussion and an important one as well. If you guys have any more questions, please feel free to email Michael himself, or you can contact O20 through our Instagram as well. But let's give him a round of applause over Zoom. Yeah, so thank you all so much for participating today and joining our first guest lecture. And a very special thank you to Professor Dr. Michael Meeuwis as well. We also have a feedback form for you guys, which we will send out to all of you via the contact information that you provided us, basically to let us know how we did, what went well, and maybe what we can improve on for the next time. So yeah, I think that concludes that for this evening. Thank you all so much again.
And if you have any questions, if you have any questions for us, you can always DM us on Instagram. And if you have any questions for Michael, we will provide his email that is provided to us. If there was any questions you couldn't have answered because time constraints or whatever other reason, feel free to reach out to him personally as well.
Thank you very much. I want to thank everyone who's been present, been listening to me. Thank you very much for participating. Thank you very much for the questions. And sorry again for having taken much more time than I actually expected myself to. Sorry for that.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, guys. And hope to see you guys maybe in the future. Bye, guys.
Thank you.